Anyway, let's me start today with saying that I left you with the Declaration of Independence and the idea that the revolution at the time was thought of as being a revolution in men's minds and or people's minds. The quotations we have about that refer to men, but it was also a revolution in women's minds as well. And I'm writing about that right now for my new book. But having done that concept of the Declaration of Independence, not only that all people were created equal, but also that they had a right to consent to their government, which was central to the way people thought about governance in this era. All I wanted to do today was talk briefly about the fighting of the Revolutionary War, because people are interested in that. I will tell you, I am not terribly interested in that, in the little pieces of it, and so I may give it short shrift. I am much more interested in the larger contours of why the fighting mattered and what it meant. So this, if you're not interested in the fighting or are particularly interested in the fighting, this might be a good option for you to skip. But I'm happy to tell you what I know about the fighting of the Revolutionary War, with the realization that I am not a military historian and I know the later wars much better than I know this one. So that's where I'm going to go today, is just talking about the way the fighting played out between the North and the South in this particular war, in the Revolutionary War. Now, one of the things that you must remember to understand the fighting of the Revolutionary War is, first of all, that with the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War in 1763, the French were forced to give up to the English the land that they claimed in the center of of what is now the United States. And that's essentially, and again, all times and temperatures are approximate here, that's essentially as if you took the original 13 plus the lands that they claimed to the west and flipped it over. So that's a lot of land out there. And if you remember, in 1763, the king proclaimed that the Americans could not cross over the Appalachian Mountains into that land because he didn't want to create more stress with the indigenous people who lived there, that had led to sparking the French and Indian War in America. So you need to remember that the French had only given up that land in 1763, and they're mad about it. And the indigenous Americans are also not real keen on that, because they had, for a lot of them, they've been working with one side or the other depending on which they thought was more advantageous to their own system. But a lot of people had worked with the French, and they were accustomed to working with the French, and they needed the French in many ways. I have not talked a huge amount here about indigenous history. I have done a whole other series on that. But one of the problems that was created by the disease that wiped out the tribes was it badly destabilized both the economies and I hate to say legal systems, because then people think about laws, but the justice systems in indigenous tribes. So a lot of those tribes, especially those around the Great Lakes, worked with the French sort of to create new justice systems and new economic systems and new social systems that stabilized their communities. So the idea that the English were going to come in and erase the French and then also try and impose their own systems on the indigenous people in that region, when the English systems were very, very different, and they were not the sort of middle ground, as one historian has famously called it, between the indigenous people and the French. The English were simply going to impose their systems on that territory. So a lot of the indigenous Americans aren't keen on this whole movement of the French out of that middle part of the country up back into Canada. And remember, when I talk about that, see, I like the bigger picture stuff. People tend to forget, but places like Illinois originally had a very strong French population as well as an indigenous population. So the history, for example, of Illinois is truly fascinating because it goes through so many hands. The same with Missouri as well, and everybody up and down the Mississippi River. So the first thing to remember is that the French have only recently left the middle of the country, and they're not keen on having left. They've largely pulled up into Canada. And the other thing to always to remember in the first half of the 18th and 19th century, the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, is that what people want are seaports. So if you think about this war, and then when we do the War of 1812, which is a remarkably interesting war, believe it or not, what you always need to remember is that in the modern era, we tend to think about land strategy, what you're going to take. That's certainly the way they're going to be thinking by the time of the Civil War. In this era, what all they really want are seaports. Nobody wants the backwoods. You can't get to the backwoods until you're going to have more canals and railroads and much more settlement. So what they're really fighting over, they're fighting over the whole system, right? But what they're really trying to get are the seaports. So that's going to change the way you think about the whole system of fighting, both in this Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 doesn't make any sense unless you recognize that it's about the coastline. It's not about anything else. All right, so let me get into this a little bit. First of all, if you remember the Declaration of Independence, with the idea that in July of 1776, the colonists who are represented in the Second Continental Congress declare that America has a right to be independent, that this is not simply a group of rebels, that in fact this is the way government should be. It should not only be made up of people who are all created equal, but also they have the right to consent to their government. And that's actually really key. That's what they have been arguing about really throughout the colonial period. They're not, you always hear taxation without representation. That's kind of a slogan to mean it's a real struggle over who should have the power in a governmental system. Should the people be able to control their government, or should in fact they have to do what the monarch says? And so when they talk about taxation without representation, what they are really saying, and they say this repeatedly in documents, is we have the right to consent to what is done to us. And it happens that for many reasons taxation is the issue that jumps to the fore, but what they're really talking about is the structure, the nature of government, which honestly I find absolutely fascinating. And the more I get into this stuff, the more kind of angry I am that I shouldn't say it was presented to me in a certain way, because I'm a scholar, right? But it's not my field. Certainly when I was in high school, they all talked about taxation without representation. Teachers and people who were reflecting on that talked about it as if basically John Hancock is tight with his money. And I'm sure that was part of it. But their language is all about what government is supposed to be. And maybe I can hear it nowadays in a different way than people could hear it in the 1970s, because in the 70s, people were talking about taxes all the time and spending money. And in this moment, we're talking about what government is supposed to be. So maybe I can see it in a way I couldn't see it, or people couldn't see it 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But it's really interesting. I spent all day yesterday reading all the declarations for various reasons, and it's really interesting how often they hit on, we have the right to consent. And then they're like, and so don't give us taxes, but they put in all these documents, we have the right to consent. All right. Anyway, even though they have said that, put yourself back in that moment, and would you have joined them? And we know historically, a third of the people were like, absolutely, I would join these people. A third of the people were like, this is a really bad idea. And a third of the people were like, we're just going to keep our mouths shut and see which way we jump, see which way this country jumps. And that's exactly the way it played out. Most Americans were neutral in the early years of the war in 1776, and that made a great deal of sense because, as I said before, it was a real stretch to think that you could peel off a set of colonies, and not all of them, by the way. Lots of the many colonies of the British government in this region didn't want any part of a rebellion. So the idea that you were going to be able to win against the British Army and the British Navy just seemed really far-fetched. So a lot of people might have thought it was a good idea, but they simply didn't think it was worth risking their necks the way that the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were willing to do. All right, so what happens is that George Washington shows up at the Second Continental Congress wearing his militia uniform. So he had been involved early on even before the French and Indian War really took off in 1754, and he was young then. He was 22 years old, and he had been part of one of the very first skirmishes, and he is actually a veteran of the French and Indian War, so he sort of feels like he knows what he's doing. And his height of in his imagination, what he wanted to do more than anything else was to be a British officer. He loved the order. He loved the power. He loved everything about that. So he sort of has this sense that he can do that with the Americans. And so he's still quite young. He's 43 years old when he shows up, and people are listening to him because he's a military hero. He's still young enough to lead a campaign, though, which is going to be a problem later on. For example, in the Civil War, when the head of the army, who's brilliant, he still thought it was a great strategist. He's so old he can't sit on a horse. It's also important that he is from the South, and that meant that he would be able to bring Southerners into a fight that was largely a New England fight at that point. John Adams at the Continental Congress then proposes that Congress go ahead and accept the volunteers who have poured into Boston after Lexington conquered in 1775. By the way, I see numbers in my head, but they don't always come out the right way. So if I say some like 1755 and you're sitting there going, wait, why did she jump back? That's me misspeaking. We're all operating here during the Revolutionary War, unless I explicitly say something like the War of 1812. Anyway, John Adams says that Congress should accept the volunteers around Boston as a Continental Army and put a commander-in-chief in charge of them. He backs George Washington, and Congress agrees. And this is a really interesting moment because think again, these are people, these are living people. And George Washington is a 43-year-old man. And by accepting a role at the head of this army, he is quite openly committing treason. And so one of the things that I think about a lot as I do what I do, right, is when you have people nowadays, Buddy calls them armchair warriors, talking about how brave they are and how they're going to do this and they're going to do that. Like, how many things are you willing, literally, to sign your own death warrant to do? Now, I can put on that right away, say my children, right? That I think most parents who are listening to this would agree with that. But then stuff starts to be about personal choice. And this very easy, like, well, I'm, these people who were at January 6th, who were like, I'm going to die for my country. They didn't expect to die for their country. And that once they got caught, and they were all like, oh, I didn't mean that, George Washington did it. George Washington he did commit treason. And had the British won, we would remember him as a traitor. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so incredibly powerful that when the signers of the Declaration sign that document, they pledge to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And to me, what sacred honor means in that is they are consigning not only their current lives and fortunes, but the way they're remembered. They were willing to put not only their pasts and their presents on the line, but also their futures. They were willing to say, yeah, I'm willing to go through life as being thought of as, I'm willing to go through eternity as being thought of as a traitor, an evil, person who tried to take down Great Britain's control over these lands. I'm willing to give everything because that's more, your fortune is one thing, your life is another thing, but the way you're remembered for eternity is huge, right? Anyway, Washington does that. Now, just I will be the first to say I have a lot of issues with the founders and the framers. And I will talk about those. But I also don't want to downplay the extraordinary courage of what they did and the extraordinary power of what they did. And for me, one of those things is George Washington being willing, for all his personal reasons, that this is what he wanted to do and all that. It's very easy for us to say that now that he's on the winning team. But the fact that he did that at a time when it looked like he was on the losing team, to me, says so much about actual political courage. To step up and say, yeah, I'm willing to go down with this ship because this political decision matters so much to me in terms of the position of human government. And that you see that in other places. And I'm not making a direct comparison, but think of some of the leaders now, for example, like Volodymyr Zelensky, like Alexei Navalny. Now, in terms of their politics, it may be that we disagree with a lot of them. They are not heroes in many ways. I mean, all human beings are flawed, for sure. But to have the political courage to say, I'm willing to go down with this ship, is no small thing. And George Washington had that. And one of the things I get upset about when we only focus on the bad of any human being is that in this case, I mean, there are some people, I don't care that apparently Adolf Hitler was a good painter. I know people are mixed up, but he's on the bad side. George Washington did this. And that was no small thing that he did that, for all the politics behind it and all that. Anyway, he goes off to Cambridge, Massachusetts to command the army, which is settled around Boston, or the militias, which are settled around Boston. And they actually stayed briefly at Harvard Yard, if you know that area. The building that's now known as Massachusetts Hall at Harvard Yard, where the president's office, the university president's office is. That's where that I believe was George Washington's headquarters. But he's going to pull out of there at some point, and I don't remember in which order this was, and live in Somerville. And I mention that because I always joke about the fact that everything in the world at some point happened in Somerville, Massachusetts. And you think I'm kidding, and I'm really not. George Washington lived there. I used to have a whole list of everything that happened in Somerville, Massachusetts. Washington lived there, obviously, and here's my other great tidbit about that is Marshmallow Fluff also comes from Somerville, Massachusetts, which just proves what a great place it is. I'm sorry. I know somebody is over there gagging because you don't like Marshmallow Fluff, but Somerville is like a remarkably important place. Anyway, so he goes into Cambridge to command the army. And, he's a dignified planter at this point. He still admires the British Army. He still obviously cares deeply about hierarchies, and he thinks people like him should be at the top of them. He expects that he is going to be able to create a very highly trained, well-commanded, efficiently equipped, heavily drilled army that is run by quite savage discipline, the same way that the British Army is, and have an aristocratic officer corps with rank and file soldiers. I mean, this is really his dream, and you know perfectly well it's not going to happen, right? So, but this is what he is expecting to have. It's not the way it's going to play out at all. In fact, at the height of the campaign, there's going to be 50,000 British troops in America, including 30,000 Hessians, and Americans are never going to be able to meet their level of drilling and their level of discipline. In fact, when the Army first settles around Boston, they are recruited from the local militias, and they had converged on Boston in 1775, of course, and an initial force of about 16,000 of them create the regulars. The regular army, not the volunteers who are going to come in as parts of the militia. Now, at first, there's this huge flurry of people enlisting in the army because they all want a piece of what's going to happen, and that's going to fall apart pretty quickly. Our army, George Washington's army, is going to be chronically short of men and supplies, and that's really going to matter when we get to the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And this is a piece you all always ask me about the Second Amendment, and there are many things that go into the well-regulated militia part of that. But one of those things is that the only experience that the people who frame the Constitution have with the military is this war, and they recognize that it's a crap show, really, that they are not able to create an efficient national army, and so they're hoping to cobble it together so that the states pay for it, because this is the other problem they're going to have throughout this war, is being able to pay for anything. Even people who are enthusiastic about the war don't want to join because they don't like the discipline. The pay is very low, and also because of the disease that's going to run through the camps. Because remember, and this is a huge point in all of American history, is that we don't understand germ theory until about 1888. Now, other people are aware of it. It's certainly coming on to other countries, aware of it. It's certainly coming on to the radar screen by 1881, when James Garfield is shot, and one of his doctors, the doctor who basically kills him, keeps probing the wound with dirty hands and dirty instruments. And there is another doctor there that has somebody else is brought in who's like, I think you better wash your hands. And the first doctor is like, you're a quack. That's not an issue. You know, go get away from me. So that's 1881. By 1888, it is an established theory. And by 1890, the U.S. Army is operating in as sterile as they can get conditions. So until we know that, disease is going to be a huge issue anytime groups of people come together, because they don't know what causes disease. They don't know it's not okay to let food rot in the streets. They don't know it's not okay to throw your slops from your chamber pots into the streets. They know it stinks, but they don't understand yet how dirty that is and how it's going to create disease. So anytime you get all these soldiers together from all these different places, they're going to exchange disease, and there's going to be disease from the latrines, for example. And you're going to see that, of course, right through the Civil War. When the disease kills, I think it's more soldiers during the Civil War than bullets do, but I could be wrong about that. It's certainly a huge number. By the time we get there, I'll have my notes out on that. All right, so I'm sorry, somebody said that I'm quiet. I was just on we're doing a live show tonight, and so I was just on that, and it was too loud, so maybe I need to turn this up. Although I can't figure out how, so I guess you're going to have to deal. I'll try and speak up. All right, so most people who wanted to fight in the war preferred to be part of what were called the Irregulars. Those were people who joined up when the army was in the area, who took pot shots at the British when they could, but who weren't locked into fighting with the army on a regular basis. And this is a big problem for Washington, because he wants that large, heavily trained army, and he wants to be able to fight long campaigns, and you simply can't do that with these local militias who answer to the people at home. They don't answer to what is still not a national government. And I'm going to talk more in the future about the experiments with creating a government during a war, because remember, the whole point of the Declaration of Independence was to say, we're not going to be part of your government anymore. But that document does not create a new government. They're going to have to figure out how to do that in the midst of a war. And they do. They make some really interesting experiments that are going to play out until the present day as we're fighting over who has control over what. So finally, the politicians refused to have a standing army. That's one of the reasons that they'd gotten into trouble with Britain to begin with. But finally, they recognize that they're not going to be able to continue to idealize this idea of a citizen soldier. And that whole concept that you can leave your home and go fight a war and then go back to your home got deeply rooted in American thought in this period. And it's always been a misnomer. People who study soldiers and who study societies always point out that in many ways for Americans, the idea of a citizen soldier is kind of a get out of jail free card, in that there is this idea that you can send people to war and then kind of drop them when they get home. And veterans advocates, of course, will tell you that that's not at all the case. It's never been the case, that veterans always come home with, not all of them necessarily, but most of them come home with some kind of wound, even if it is not a visible wound. And that's a really important thing to remember when we get, for example, to the Civil War, where there's not a system in place immediately for dealing with veterans. But then largely after World Wars I and II, and now, of course, after Iraq and Afghanistan, where our badly injured veterans are really not visible in the general population. And that always sort of freaks me out, because there are a lot of people who are going to need a lot of care from people like me for the rest of their, and I don't mean literally, I don't have people who were injured in those wars, but we as a society have asked those people to fight for us, and we actually, this idea that they can just drop everything and suddenly go back to working for, I don't know, a computer repair company is really not correct. And that's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And I will not wax more on that now, because I know I'm running out of time really to talk about the fighting, which I'm sure some of you are here to talk about. But it is certainly worth thinking about the pipeline that we have had recently of returning veterans into right-wing organizations. And that's in part, I think, because I'll stop. all the point here simply being that the idea of citizen soldiers was created to say we don't really need to have a standing army because we'll be able to have these people go back to their farms when they get home. Anyway, so finally Congress overcomes its scruples about creating a standing army, and in September of 1776, it sets terms in the Continental Army at 3 years or for the duration of the war, which is going to be unfortunate when the war goes on a long time. And it tells each state that it has to organize, it has to raise a certain number of troops. And that's going to be the way troops are raised until the Civil War. They offer bounties to men, that is cash payments, in order to sign up, as well as a yearly clothing issue. And if you fight for the war, you're going to get 100 acres of land as well. Finally, a year later, when people still aren't showing up, Congress recommended that the states adopted a draft, and some did, but Congress still could not compel them to meet their troop quotas. So the troops that come in are untrained. They aren't used to Army discipline. They don't want Army discipline. They refuse to drill. They slip away from camp at night. They leave sentry duty. They take pot shots at the British, which is not good for any number of both morale and strategic reasons. And they don't bother to clean the camps. The camps are filthy. The officers are also inexperienced. So as you can tell, this is going nowhere good at first. So what happens is the people who take over the responsibility for keeping the army functioning essentially are known as the women of the army. And remember, the colonial leaders have no experience with pulling together an army. So they don't have a commissariat. They don't have a medical corps. They don't have any of the logistical pieces that a functioning army needs to have. And the people who pick that up are women. So they are going to be women who follow along with the army, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. But many women, of course, when their husbands and fathers go off to war, pick up the slack at home. So they're going to run the farms, they're going to keep their houses together, they're going to continue to rear their children. They're also going to supply the troops. They're going to be doing the ones sewing the uniforms. You're not going to have, of course, the rise of contracting until the Civil War, really, for things like uniforms. They're going to make blankets. They're going to collect rags to make bandages. They're going to collect lead for bullets. And they're also going to organize to help the people who are left orphaned or widowed by their menfolk going away and perhaps not coming back, or even still just being gone for a number of years. But if you were the wife of a poor man and you did not have the ability, either the land or the ability to maintain a farm, you start to drift after the army. So there were thousands of women like that. Historians figure there were about one woman for every 15 soldiers. And the army provided them with half rations, not with full rations, but for half rations, they cooked for the soldiers, they washed for the soldiers, they nursed the wounded, they buried the dead, and they scavenged the fields for clothing and for equipment. There were even more women who followed the British Army to scavenge the fields and to try and make a living that way. George Washington complained bitterly about these women. He complained that they were a clog upon every movement, as he said, of the army. And he tried desperately to bring order to them and was really never able to do that. This was a huge deal for him, but it's really interesting when you think about our lionization of Betsy Ross as the quintessential sort of woman of the Revolutionary War. She's a seamstress, and she works in the pictures that people shared of her. She worked in quite an enclosed space, sewing, a very womanly activity, if you will. In fact, she was quite an adept businesswoman who managed her own business in Philadelphia and was only one of all the people who were making different flags for the military. But what's interesting is that these women of the army largely got read out of the way we remember that period because they're not in an enclosed space. They're not at home. They're not knitting. They're literally scavenging the field or burying the dead and acting actually with the army. And when we remember the role of women in that period, our memory of that was really quite deliberately a change in what actually had happened. So the women, we remember Betsy Ross, and she's sewing away, when in fact women, a lot of women, were actually with the army and performing what were not in the early republic considered womanly tasks, and that's not what we tend to remember. All right. They also fought as well. And I'm not going to really go into that now because I don't really want to talk too much about the military. And they were sex workers as well. And I'll talk much more about that sort of role for women when we get to the Civil War. All right, so let's talk about strategy here. If you're Washington and you got this ragtag group of people and you're up against the British Army, what are you going to do? I mean, I'd probably turn tail and run. But what he's going to do is his role is going to be simply to guarantee that the British can't win. His role is not to win against the British. He needs to make sure they can't win, which is, you can think of, I'm sure you can think of modern day comparisons where that is solely the plan. Make sure they can't win, because if they can't win, they're going to have to leave, as opposed to saying, we're going to win. There is a distinction there. He knows he can't have an open fight with the British, that he will not win. Now, if you're the British, what you want to do is take the seaports, because if you can take the seaports, you can cut off trade, you can cut off these colonies, and they're going to have to come crawling back because they're going to be on their knees. So the war is going to be fought largely, not entirely, but largely for control of the seaports and to convince on the part of the British, and on the American side, it's going to be fought to show the British they can't win. Not necessarily to win battles, but to show the British they can't win. Those are, as I say, those are very different things. So the way it plays, and there's going to be two entirely different wars in a sense. There's going to be the Northern War that I'll start talking about, and then there's going to be the Southern War. And those two wars matter. I mean, it's the same war, but these two different, what's the word? Not venues. I can't think of the word, but these two different places where they're fighting the war is going to matter later to American history because of the way that people remember that war. And that's going to matter a lot. And I'll point that out to you when we get to it. All right, so in March of 1776, George Washington barricades the army that he's overseen in Dorchester Heights. And Dorchester Heights commands Boston Harbor. Remember, we did before how Boston is at this point an island, quite a small, not an island, a peninsula. At high tide, there is the spit of land, which I think runs along Washington Street now, where 4 horses can walk abreast, and that's it. So by being out on Dorchester Heights, which now feels like it's part of the city, but at the time it was away from that, Washington could command control over Boston. And the British commander, General William Howe, knew that, and he knew he couldn't stay in Boston because of that, and also because of the hostility of the people in Boston. So he had already decided to evacuate Boston. And in March of 1776, he moves all of his troops out of Boston into Boston to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So he moves out in March. And here's a trivia question. Does anybody know, and I won't be able to say this. Yeah, Boston is largely landfill, Tom, yes. There's great maps about that. Does anybody know what that date is? It's such Boston trivia. Theaters, that's the word, Ken. Theaters, that's what I was trying to say. Trivia here. It's March 17th. It's St. Patrick's Day. Everybody thinks that Bostonians get St. Patrick's Day off. We actually get Evacuation Day off, the day that there was the evacuation. And at least that's the day we celebrate it. And I love that trivia for my students because they're always like, we get St. Patrick's Day off in Massachusetts. I'm like, no, you don't. No, you don't. You get Evacuation Day off. And that's when the troops pull out of Boston. That's it, Bruce. St. Patrick's Day, Evacuation Day. That's right. And that's why, anytime you're in Boston, everyone's like, they're celebrating the Irish. Well, we do now celebrate the Irish history of that city, but the date is Evacuation Day. All right. So meanwhile, he has finally figured out that the issue here is no longer about simply trying to get rid of the few ringleaders that they were aiming for before. The issue is going to be to get major cities and to win such a decisive battle that the colonials won't go forward, won't go on. So that's what the British are going to want to do. So where's he going to go? New York City, the first place he's going to try and hit and take is New York City. And it's a smart place for him to go because it's centrally located amongst all the colonies. And there's a lot of loyalists in New York City. Remember, New York City has always been a real political mix-up in a way, for example, that Boston never was. And it's also got a great harbor, so he's going to be able to get his ships in there. So this seems like it's going to be a really good idea for him. What they do then is he lands on Staten Island in July of 1776. And the Americans then march from Boston and fortify Brooklyn Heights on Long Island with the idea that they're going to be able to defend New York City at the tip of Manhattan, on Manhattan Island from Brooklyn Heights. By mid-August, 32,000 British troops, including 8,000 Hessians, are facing off against 23,000 Americans. And on August 22nd, Howe begins to move on Long Island. And he moves across Long Island and he pushes the Americans back. He pushes them back to Manhattan Island. Then the Americans decide maybe this isn't such a great place to be, and the troops start to melt away. Again, imagine you're living through this. They've just declared independence. This is going to be just great, except it's not. Once faced with the British Army, the Americans are like, oh, oopsie poopsie, maybe never mind. They push Americans back into Westchester County on the mainland. Then in the fall of 1776, Howe forces George Washington first north into New York, and then south into New Jersey, and then back across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And Washington just keeps backing up. I mean, he's fighting these skirmishes and backing up and fighting a skirmish and backing up. Because again, he just wants to show them they can't win. They're trying to win against him. They push him back against the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 7th of 1776. Now, Howe's sitting there thinking, oh, this is just basically a done deal. Like, I don't need to worry about this anymore. These guys are sitting out there in Pennsylvania. It's winter. It's miserable. I'm out of it here. I'm going back to New York City for Christmas, for the holidays. Have some nice punch, have some feasts, and celebrate the fact that we're about to put down this rebellion. He leaves to hold the position, a group of Hessians in a city, in a town, to hold the positions. The colonials have only about 3,000 men, and half of their enlistments are ending with the new year. So George Washington recognizes that he has to do something. So what he does is what you have all seen all the paintings about. On the night of Christmas, Christmas night, which is bitter cold and sleeting, so it's rain and snow and sleet, he brings the Americans back across the Delaware River, cross icy roads, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, he surprises the Hessians at Trenton. And the Hessians, it's Christmas, and Christmas is celebrated with drinking in this era. The Hessians have all been drinking all night, and he attacks them in Trenton, and they surrender. This is the very famous crossing of the Delaware, the falling on the Christmas Eve, Christmas Day on the Hessians, and this is this spectacular moment when Washington says, nope, you haven't won yet. And that's going to inject real morale back into the U.S. Army. I'm sorry, it's not U.S. yet, the colonial army. Meanwhile, Howe looks at what's happened, and he sends a force under Charles Lord Cornwallis to push back, to like, hey, wait a second here, what's going on here? We're going to push the Americans back. They're not Americans yet, colonials back. And Washington slips around him, doesn't actually fight a pitched battle with him. Instead, he strikes at the British again in Princeton. Middle of nowhere, that battlefield is still there. He strikes at Princeton, at the British in Princeton, and wins that battle. Then he pulls back and goes into winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, while the British pull back to New York City, which is a strategic mistake for them because they go into New York City and they piss everybody off. Like, they're strutting around, they threaten people, they take food, they're an occupying army, and occupying armies are virtually never popular. Although, interestingly enough, there is a whole military school of thought now about what one should look for in an occupying army. And one of the big writers on that, believe it or not, is David Petraeus, if you remember that man's name. That's one of the ways one of his bodies of scholarship. Not that I'm urging you to go read his dissertation, which I did many years ago, but it's interesting that there is an increasing recognition that you can't take a fighting army and turn it into an occupying army without real trouble. Anyway, when they do that, the New York City, which had previously, had a lot of loyalists, switches to side with the colonials, with the rebels. All right. Summer of 1777, General Howe decides he's going to take Philadelphia. George Washington once again knows he cannot fight a large battle, but he also doesn't want the capital to be taken. So he does meet the British, and the Americans lose a major battle at Brandywine Creek. They retreat. They don't retweet. They retreat, and the British take Philadelphia. George Washington then attacks the main force at Germantown and is once again forced to retreat. Still, he's made enough of an impact on the British, who of course have to bring more supplies and more troops, especially from overseas. They can't afford to lose many people. He's made enough of an impression about them that they're starting to be nervous. Meanwhile, as the British are taking places like Philadelphia and New York and making people there angry, the locals start to cut their supply lines. So it's getting more and more difficult for them to supply their troops. Meanwhile, in June of 1777, there has been a big disaster for the British in Saratoga, New York, up in Saratoga, when General John Burgoyne had moved down from Canada into New York, so convinced that he was going to beat the colonials that he had actually brought cases of champagne with him along with a silver dining service. And the troops have a terrible time with the roads, which are muddy, and it's very hard to move the caissons along them, and it's a mess. They're exhausted by the time they get to Saratoga, and Benedict Arnold leads an attack on the British near Saratoga. He's not actually the commander, but he leads an attack, creates a brutal battle that finally does in fact lead to the the colonials being pushed back, but they have very badly battered the British army, and eventually the British army has to surrender to the overall leader, Horatio Gates. What that does is it convinces the British that they might not win. The Saratoga becomes this really big deal for both the British and the Americans, because, as I say, all George Washington has to do is convince the British they're not going to win, and all the Americans have to do is convince themselves that the British aren't going to win. Not that they're going to win, but that the British aren't going to win, and Saratoga accomplishes that. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, I told you not to forget about the French, because the French are still really mad about the Treaty of Paris of 1763 and the loss of all their land. And they would like that land back. So the Americans recognize that they need help, and who else to go to but the French? I mean, it's an obvious thing to do. So in November of 1776, the Americans, the colonials, send a commission to France to get help for their war effort. And the person they put in charge is Benjamin Franklin. And this is one of my favorite episodes in Franklin history, because Franklin is a Renaissance man. He experimented with electricity and with lending libraries, and with, he's part of learned societies. He's everywhere, all over the map. He's incredibly smart. He's a printer, he's a thinker, he's a writer, he's a ladies' man. He's all number of things. What he is not is a naif. But he recognizes that the French really love this idea of the wide-eyed American. So he adopts the use of coonskin cap, that picture you've seen with him looking like a backwoods bumpkin. He does that incredibly deliberately. They love the idea of American innocence, so he pretends that he is innocent. He wears the little spectacles, the little hat, and he convinces the French that they want to be part of the American effort. And one of the things that enables him to do that is Saratoga, because after Saratoga, when the English recognize it's not going to be easy, they in fact offer to the Americans a return to where they were in the status quo before 1763. And the French, of course, are terrified that the Americans will accept that, and Franklin sort of bats his eyes and says to the French, "Ooh, you wouldn't like that, would you? Don't you want to help us?" And that turns the trick. In February of 1778, the French sign a treaty of commerce, friendship, and alliance with the colonials, and the Congress, the Continental Congress, approves the treaty in May. Now, just let me run down that rabbit hole a little bit. What that's going to do is it's going to put a huge burden on the French treasury, which is one of the things that eventually is going to lead to the instability that's going to lead to the French Revolution. So when we get further on and Americans are like, we got to help the French, they helped us out, part of that is quite literally the instability in France is a reflection of the fact that they had helped the Americans. What happens then is that the French renounce all future claims to the land in America and to relinquish any territory that was captured in the war. And you just got to credit Franklin for that, because that was a huge concession. That, of course, means that the British are going to have to declare war now on the French. And a year later, Spain joins the war on the French side because it, too, wants to recover some of its lost territory. The Dutch are also later going to get involved. And this, of course, is going essentially to create a world war, or at least a European and North American war. So that's a lot of the world. And it's going to make it very difficult now for the British to be able to exert their control back over these rogue colonies. Nonetheless, it's not clear that the Americans are actually going to be able to pull it off, because the winter of 1777 through the winter of 1778 is terrible for the colonials. They have settled down into Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There are about 11,000 soldiers. They have very little clothing and very little food. They're huddled in huts, and they're furious at the people who have asked them to fight and who are refusing to supply them. As many as 2,500 soldiers died at Valley Forge. Now why were people talking up this great country and then ignoring the soldiers? And the answer to that is by late 1777, early 1778. The soldiers tended to be poorer men of a lower class, drifters. They were, ironically, they were showing up for the food and the paycheck, which is going to mean that this fight for liberty, as it's going to be constructed, is actually fought by some of the least free people in colonial society. By spring of 1778, though, things have started to turn around, in part because better food is coming in, better supplies are coming in. Also because of a character named Baron von Steuben, who is a penniless soldier of fortune from Prussia. There's a lot of discussion now about who he might have been. There's been some suggestion that he is trans. I think most historians believe he was that he was a gay man, and sort of illustrates not only with his extraordinary military power and ability to turn these ragtag soldiers into a fighting force, the idea that somehow when people talk about gay or trans history being something newfangled and invented, here we have the very beginning of American history, somebody who is commented on as either gay or trans in this period. So we know this is not reading back into history, that he's there from the very beginning, or she's there, they're there from the very beginning. So von Steuben pulls them into some kind of a good fighting force, and that improves their morale. Meanwhile, finally, the British decide they're not going to keep fighting this long, drawn-out fighting and retreating in the north. Instead, they're going to go to the south. And so in June of 1778, after a battle outside of New York, the Americans are going to camp. The the colonial army is going to sort of settle down outside of New York, and the British are going to take the fight down to the American South. The fighting in the South is going to be very different than the fighting in the North, and this matters because it's going to change the way that people remember the American Revolution. So the British decide that if they go to the South, they're going to be able to gather a lot of loyalists to themselves because they believe that that region is still much more loyal to them than the North is. And the South is badly divided, as I've talked about before, between enslaved Americans and enslavers and different religions and, all sorts of class divisions, ethnic divisions. And they hope that they're going to be able to call loyalists to themselves. And at first that works. But they make a terrible tactical error in that when they take areas like Savannah, they make everybody swear a loyalty oath, or everybody that they can get on their side to take a loyalty oath, and then they pull back out. So everybody who has sworn a loyalty oath is now at the mercy of those who didn't swear a loyalty oath. And this is going to further destabilize those colonies and also really infuriate people. It's like, wait a minute. I swore loyalty to you because you asked me to, and now you've left me at the mercy to George over here, So that is going to mean that the South doesn't take the British side as much as it ought to have. They do take Savannah and Charleston. They go in and then they pull back out. Meanwhile, the British major commander pulls out and goes back to the north, leaving Cornwallis behind to take South Carolina. And what happens then is after 1780, there is a brutal civil war that breaks out between the loyalists and the rebels in South Carolina. And that brutal fighting essentially creates guerrilla warfare. And rebels like people like Francis Marion, who becomes known as the Swamp Fox, cut the British lines. Meanwhile, people like Thomas Sumter, known as the Gamecock, attack the Loyalists. And the British fight a big battle at Kings Mountain, and they lose in October of 1780. Most people watching this become convinced that they're better off siding with the rebels than they are siding with the British. And the reason that this matters going forward is because this is the way that the South is going to remember the war. They're not going to remember the war as being about essentially a war of attrition in the North. They're going to remember the war as being about sort of guerrilla warfare in which people like the Swamp Fox take down the British Army. And that's going to affect the way that they go into the Confederacy, because they're going to be like, hey, yeah, we don't have the men, we don't have the material, we don't have the food, we don't have any of that stuff, but by God, we can lurk in the swamps. And they forget what happened in the North, and that's really going to matter. And you look at the way that they lionize these people at the beginning of the war, and you see that this is exactly what they're up to. Meanwhile, Congress replaces Horatio Gates with a commander named Nathaniel Greene, and he understands that the South is different. He recognizes that the men down there need better supplies, and he gets von Steuben to lobby Congress or lobby Virginia for food and clothes. He recognizes that he does not need an army. He needs to supply irregulars down in the South. And he sends Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee, who's known as Light Horse Harry, to assist Francis Marion. And they say to their men, the people down here are exhausted. You absolutely may not hit them up for supplies. You can't steal supplies. And they keep a really good control over their irregulars because they recognize that that's just going to destroy the will of the population to continue to support them. So they do that. They also manage to get a Polish engineer who knows how to make flatboats and bridges, which is going to enable them to cross places that the British are not going to be able to cross, which is really interesting because, again, that kind of gets forgotten. And that's one of the things that's going to help the North a lot during the Civil War. So the Americans are able essentially to make the British run after them until finally they stop and fight and they inflict some damage on the British, and then they run away again. And they're basically running the British army over the, across the South. And finally, in North Carolina, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, when each side is badly hurt, Cornwallis has had it. And he says, I am quite tired of marching about the country in quest of adventures. And he decides he wants to have a showdown once and for all on Chesapeake Bay. So in June of 1781, Cornwallis and now Benedict Arnold, who has switched sides, that's why we use the word Benedict Arnold as a name for traitor, begin to fortify a site on the tip of the peninsula that is formed by the confluence of the York and the James Rivers. And this is going to be Yorktown, of course. Meanwhile, George Washington meets with his French ally, Comte Rochambeau, in Connecticut, and they try and come up with a plan. And George Washington wants to retake New York, and Rochambeau says, no, I think we should go and go for a land sea assault on the Virginia coast. And they're arguing about it when it turns out they get news that, in fact, all the various teams are already starting to move toward that place in Virginia. So finally, at the end of September, there are 7,800 French, 5,700 Americans, and 3,200 militia who are standing on one side of Yorktown, and the French fleet is on the other side, and the British are in between. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. And when he does so, when the King's first minister, Lord North, hears that, he says, "Oh God, it is over." And he resigns. Cornwallis's surrender drains the British will to fight on the North American continent in this moment, in part because of the timing. The British had just lost ground in India, in the West Indies, and in Florida, and they knew that France and Spain were planning a major offensive against Gibraltar. And they recognized that they simply could not handle the costs of all that this was going to cost them, and they had to preserve what they could. Finally, then they sign a treaty. The colonials and the British sign another Treaty of Paris. Remember, I told you they were all treaties of Paris? Sign another Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783, and it is an enormous diplomatic triumph for the colonial negotiators. Those negotiators are Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. And what they did is they convinced the British that a magnanimous settlement might weaken the American ties to France. And at the same time, they convinced the French that they had to be united because they were allies. So that treaty meant that the British recognized American independence. It gave the boundaries of the new colonial nation, the boundaries of the Mississippi River, the present boundary of Canada in that region. There's going to be an argument over Maine later on, and the 31st parallel to the south. And the Spanish continued to have Florida in that period. So what we ended up with coming out of this revolution with this Treaty of Paris was the idea of a nation and the signatures of the British on that document that said they were not going to fight anymore. But the American, and we certainly celebrate this for many reasons, but the independence of the United States of America, which hasn't been constructed yet, we're going to have to wait for a couple of weeks to construct the United States of America. But the idea that the British were really not going to fight anymore is not at all clear. Again, if you are thinking about this from the perspective of a British strategist, so you lost this one, but look at those Americans. They fight about everything. They're divided by ethnicity, by language, by culture, by race, by class. You name it. They can't agree on anything except right now that they hate us. So if, in fact, you could simply pull back, for example, to Canada or to the West, and wait for the Americans to tear themselves apart, you might, in fact, be able to come back and take all that land back over again. And that's what we're going to be doing from now until we get to 1815 and the end of the War of 1812, is really a continuation of the idea of whether or not it's going to be possible to turn this squabbling, extraordinarily different group of people into a nation. It did not happen during the Revolutionary War overnight. They still don't have a viable government. I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. It's going to take them a long time to get a viable government. And once they get that, then they still have to agree on how that government works and be able to fight off a major European power. And none of that's going to be clear until 1816 at least. All right, sorry there were troubles with the hearing. And I'm hoping that the person who puts these on YouTube will marry these two things together. So they do stand together. I wanted to do them together. You can see why now. And I will pick up with the stuff I find much more fun next week with how do you construct a government in the middle of all this? And that's, to me, really interesting because many of the questions that they dealt with during this period are ones we are still dealing with today. All right, thank you very much for that. If you did not pick this up, Carol Anderson, Joanne Freeman, and I are doing a live show tonight on essentially on the Second Amendment and on guns. And Carol is an expert on that, of course, and she's totally fun. So I hope you can join us. It's at 6:30. You can either watch it on my Facebook page or you can sign up through the cafe website. And I'm not managing either of those, so they should go. I shouldn't say this, but they should go off without a hitch. Thank you for being here, and I will talk to you again soon.